Welcome to today's Explainer, where we're diving into what is honestly one of the most unprecedented historical anomalies of the modern era. We're looking at a nation that did the absolute unthinkable. They didn't just develop the ultimate weapon, they voluntarily gave up their entire nuclear arsenal. It's this incredibly fascinating story of geopolitics, economics, and major domestic shifts. I'm super excited to explore exactly how and why this whole thing happened. Let's get right into it.
Right off the bat, this brings up a massive paradox, right? Why build nuclear weapons just to destroy them? Usually, when a nation acquires nuclear capabilities, they hold onto them super tightly. It literally becomes the cornerstone of their entire national security strategy. But, as we're about to see here, historical pressures can actually force a complete 180 on even the most deeply entrenched military strategies.
So, Part 1, the ultimate nuclear anomaly, looking at decades of secret development. Okay, before we can really understand the destruction of these weapons, we've got to grasp the sheer massive scale of South Africa's covert program. 6. That's the magic number. It's not some rough estimate or a hypothetical guess. Our sources explicitly indicate the apartheid regime successfully and completely secretly built exactly 6 atomic bombs. And you have to remember, building even one atomic weapon requires just an astonishing level of scientific engineering, highly specialized materials, and massive infrastructure. So to build 6? That means they had established a highly capable, fully functioning, and deeply covert nuclear weapons program.
And just think about the sheer cost involved here. As the source notes, this required decades and billions of dollars secretly building nuclear weapons. Billions. All that secret labor, all those resources pouring into the creation of an arsenal that, ultimately, they would just completely destroy. To abandon an investment of that absolute magnitude? Well, you'd need some overwhelming pressure. So what exactly were those pressures?
Well, that brings us to our first pillar, the vanishing Soviet threats. You see, the decision in 1989 to actually abandon the nuclear program definitely wasn't made in a vacuum. It was forced by 3 massive converging pressures. Let's look at the first one, the rapidly shifting geopolitical landscape. The original goal of the program was highly specific, basically to deter Soviet-backed neighbors. But by 1989, that reality had completely evaporated. The Soviet Union was basically on its last leg, and the whole Cold War dynamic that had fueled the program in the first place was just rapidly dissolving right before their eyes. Because that threat had essentially vanished, the government was suddenly left with what our source perfectly describes as an expensive, useless nuclear arsenal. The collapse of the Soviet threat instantly transformed these incredibly costly weapons from a vital strategic deterrent into a huge, useless burden. They were literally paying exorbitant maintenance costs for a shield against an enemy that, for all intents and purposes, no longer existed.
Moving on to Pillar 2, crippling global sanctions.
The evaporation of the external military threat was really just the beginning of the story. At this exact same time, global trade sanctions were absolutely crippling South Africa's economy. The international community had isolated the country, and these severe economic sanctions were just devastating their domestic markets. The financial strain was immense, to say the least, and the government was desperately looking for any possible way to relieve that pressure and normalize their international trade.
So the leadership faced a really stark reality. Step 1, dismantle the weapons. Step 2, re-enter world markets. Destroying the nukes was viewed as their absolute only ticket back into the global economy. If they wanted those crippling sanctions lifted, the secret nuclear arsenal, which, remember, was now strategically totally useless anyway, it just had to go. And that brings us to the third and final pillar, a shifting political landscape.
So we've looked at the geopolitical shift with the Soviets and the global economic shift with the sanctions, right? Now we've got to transition to the final internal domestic factor that drove this highly consequential 1989 decision. Internally, the white minority regime was losing power. According to the source material, the apartheid government knew its control over the country was rapidly coming to an end, and a massive transition of power was right there on the immediate horizon. Specifically, President F.W. de Klerk recognized this imminent reality. The African National Congress would soon take over the government. The leadership was acutely aware that they were in their final days of governance, and as the sources point out, this impending transfer of power heavily influenced their strategic military decisions.
And this brought a really decisive domestic motivation to the table. According to the historical record we're looking at, President de Klerk absolutely did not want a future black-led government inheriting operational nukes. So this internal political motivation, combined with the fact that the arsenal was now useless against external threats, plus their desperate need for economic relief, it all finalized the decision to completely destroy the 6 atomic bombs.
Leading us to a historical thirst: successful disarmament. The convergence of those 3 massive pressures, the vanishing Soviet threat, those crippling economic sanctions, and the internal transfer of power, resulted in an outcome that the world had literally never seen before and actually hasn't seen since. And just think about the speed of this cascade for a second. After decades of secret buildup and billions of dollars spent, the 1989 decision triggered a rapid dismantling. By 1991, literally just 2 years later, the entire arsenal was completely gone. Decades of painstaking work just erased in a few short months.
I really want to reiterate just how unique this is. South Africa became the first country to fully build an atomic arsenal of this nature. And to this day, it remains the only country to completely dismantle its own arsenal. Think about that. They achieved the absolute apex of military technology, only to systematically take it apart, piece by piece.
Which leaves us with a pretty profound final question to chew on. South Africa showed the world that complete disarmament is physically and politically possible when the right pressures perfectly align. But as we look at the modern world today, will any other nation ever follow suit and dismantle their expensive, useless arsenals? Will we ever see this historical anomaly repeat itself? It's definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer today, and keep asking the big questions.